As president of Duke University, I am delighted to welcome you all to the second Ambassador Dave and Kay Phillips Family International Lecture of the fall semester. The Phillips Family Lecture Series provides the Duke community an invaluable opportunity for informed discussions led by some of our nation's leading policy minds from both sides of the aisle. And while I wish that we could all be together, as in years past in Page Auditorium, this year's lecture series has particular resonance, both because the pandemic has presented us with a truly global strategy problem, and because offering tonight's program via Zoom is enabling us to reach an audience in cities and towns around the world. I'd like to begin by thanking Dave and Kay Phillips and their family for their support of this innovative program, which brings the most important voices in diplomacy and foreign policy to Duke. We're so grateful that you're helping us advance the conversation about international affairs. Thank you. Over the course of this program's history, we have been honored to host such luminaries as Robert Gates, Mitt Romney, Samantha Power, Condoleezza Rice, John Kelly, and earlier this fall, Susan Rice, to learn more about America's role on the international stage. Tonight, we are truly honored to welcome General H.R. McMaster. General McMaster is one of our nation's foremost military leaders and experts in foreign policy. He currently serves as the Fouad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and as lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He serves as chairman of the advisory board of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the Japan chair of the Hudson Institute. A native of Philadelphia, General McMaster graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1984 and served as an Army officer for 34 years. He retired as Lieutenant General in 2018. General McMaster remained on active duty while serving as the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. He taught history at West Point and holds a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But we will not hold that against him. Tonight's discussion will focus on General McMaster's newly released book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, a compelling argument for preserving America's standing on the world stage. Please join me in welcoming General H.R. McMaster.
Hey, thank you, President Price, and thank you, Professor Schanzer, for the opportunity to be with you. And I'm really anxious to see where you'd like to take the conversation. So I think I'll be quite brief with opening remarks, and what a pleasure it is to be back, at least virtually, in the Triangle area. I lived in Durham when I went to UNC and had the fondest memories of my time there, and obviously with many interactions with your great team at Duke and at UNC Chapel Hill in the years since then. But it's a real privilege to be with you. David, I'll just ask you, do you want to go right into question and answer, or do you want me to make just some brief opening remarks?
Sure. Well, I just also wanted to thank you. Of course, you've been a real friend to the whole national security community here, really for many years, and you've made many appearances, trips, participated in many programs, educational and otherwise. And so thank you for being such a stalwart friend to all of us in this region. But no, why don't we dive into it? I'm going to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your book, which I've read and I really enjoyed. Congratulations on a real tour de force on both history, strategy, and policy. So thank you for the book. And you didn't write a tell-all. You wrote, and I really do respect that as a former government official. I think we owe a duty of loyalty to the people we work for. But it's really a critical review of American foreign policy that it criticizes really many of the foundations of our national security policy across administrations. And you argue broadly that our policies have been guilty of something you call strategic narcissism and lacking in something you call strategic empathy. So I thought maybe we'd start off, if you could explain the broad frame, and then we can apply it to some of the different areas.
Well, thanks, David. I really appreciate the opportunity, as I mentioned, to be with all of you. I mean, I learned so much in the program I was in between UNC and Duke, and I just have such fond memories of those seminars that mingled together the Duke and UNC history graduate students. But I really feel as if we've lost our strategic competence, David, in the period since the Cold War. And I tell the story from a bit of a personal perspective in the book, having witnessed the end of the Cold War, the lifting or the parting of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Our cavalry regiment was patrolling the East-West German border the day that East Germany lifted travel restrictions to the West. And I tell the story of one moment staring down East German border guards, and then the next moment, the gates being thrown open, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of East Germans pouring across, bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine, and there were hugs and tears of joy, and it was quite a dramatic ending to the Cold War, and it was a period of growing confidence with good reason, right? We had won the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed, the East German government just melted away, Germany reunified, and then almost a year later, about a year later, we found ourselves in a hot war in Desert Storm. And it was really the overwhelming tactical victory over Saddam Hussein's army, the fourth largest in the world, I think that bolstered our confidence even further. And in that Cold War period, this period of optimism, I would say over optimism that led to complacency, we tended to accept three assumptions about the post-Cold War world. First of all, that there's an arc of history that had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Related to that is a second assumption that great power competition was a relic of the past. And the third assumption was that our technological military prowess would, if any adversary had the temerity to challenge the United States, make any future war fast, cheap, efficient, and waged mainly from standoff range. And I think all this data was a setup. It was a setup for shocks and disappointments in the 2000s. And it was in the 2000s that I think the emotional impetus behind foreign policy shifted from over-optimism to pessimism, and a tendency to underestimate the risks and costs of action, I think, like maybe the invasion of Iraq in 2003, to a tendency to underestimate the risks and costs of inaction, such as disengagement from the Middle East, leaving Iraq in December 2011, not enforcing the red line in Syria. And as a result, I think that both of these periods can be characterized by strategic narcissism, which I define as really looking at the world only in relation to us and assuming that what we do or decide not to do is decisive in accomplishing a favorable outcome. And the problem with this approach is it doesn't ascribe agency, influence, or authorship over the future to the other, especially adversaries, rivals, and enemies who actually do have a say in the future course of events. And so strategic empathy is a term I borrowed from a great historian named Zachary Shore, who's out here at Berkeley. He's written some great books. One is entitled Blunder, the other A Sense of the Enemy, in which he argues that we don't pay enough attention to the ideology, the emotions, and the aspirations that drive and constrain the other. And so what I write about in the book is the effort that I undertook when I came into the job as National Security Advisor to put into place a process that compensated for that deficiency, what I considered a major deficiency of our policy, and helped us craft a more sensible and sustainable long-term approach to foreign policy.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that overview. I want to hop into different areas. You divide the book into about 5 or 6 different regions of the world and go into in depth of the history and then the strategy. I'm tempted to go to Middle East because you talked about that first. So why don't we do that? And I wanted to start by saying one of your chapters on the Iraq War was entitled, "Who Said It Was Going to Be Easy?" And I wanted you to flesh out the word "it" for us. What did you mean by it? Because that seems to be a substitute for whatever the goals of U.S. foreign policy in Iraq either were or what you think they ought to be. So maybe you could talk about that. What is it that wasn't going to be easy?
Well, I think you could say regime change in Iraq, right? The invasion of Iraq and the ability to achieve a favorable outcome after deposing Saddam Hussein, a favorable outcome consistent with our vital interests in the region, which I would define as ensuring that jihadist terrorists don't have a safe haven and support base in the region, and then also limiting Iranian influence across the Middle East, as well as removing at the time what was a perceived threat of weapons of mass destruction being developed by Saddam Hussein. Of course, Saddam was trying to convince us of that. He was doing his best to convince us that that was the case, in the mistaken belief that we wouldn't invade if we felt that he had weapons of mass destruction. And of course, he had a very active chemical and nuclear programs, but had not yet developed nuclear weapons and so forth. So we often debate, David, as you know, and I'm sure you've had many of the debates there at Duke University. Should we have done it? Should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? I think a more useful debate to have is who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy? And I think this goes back to this third assumption I mentioned, associated with what became the orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs. And that reduced war to essentially just a military operation and mainly a targeting exercise against enemy forces. And it was going to be that our advanced technological capability would deliver that favorable outcome. But we forgot, and I read about this in Battlegrounds, the continuities in the nature of war that ensure that really the next war will not be fundamentally different from those that have gone before it. The form of warfare might, but war's still an extension of politics. That means that the consolidation of gains to get to a sustainable political outcome, that's not an optional phase in war unless you're just doing a raid. It's something you have to plan in advance. And we were clearly underprepared, I think, to say the least, for crafting really what would follow the collapse of Saddam's regime. The second is that war is human. People fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. And unless you're addressing the drivers of that conflict, such as the fear among the Sunni Arab community in Iraq in a post-Saddam period that they would be completely eviscerated, that led them to conclude that they can only advance their interests through violence rather than through a political process that they saw as biased against them due to de-Baathification, due to a range of policies, the disbanding of the army and so forth, that led them to the conclusion that, and the actions of Shia Islamist militias tied to Iran, that led them to that conclusion, that exacerbated their fears, that then allowed initially a decentralized, localized hybrid insurgency to coalesce and gain strength over time, ally with an Islamist insurgent and terrorist organization. And so, I mean, the rest is history, I guess. And so then the third is that war is uncertain. And David, what is astounding to me is how in the wars that we have waged in Afghanistan and Iraq, we think it's okay to announce years in advance exactly the number of troops we're going to have, exactly what they're going to do or not do, as if the future course of events just depends on our plan or our script that I guess we hand to the enemy and ask them to adhere to that script. And so the future course of events, of course, in war is never linear. And it depends on what Clausewitz called this continuous interaction of opposites, especially interactions with adversaries, rivals, enemies. And then finally, war is a contest of wills. And I think that this is an area that we've neglected as well. We have not, and I know that the Duke program has been very strong in this area. We've not done a good job at explaining to the American people, what is at stake in these wars? What is a strategy that will deliver a satisfactory outcome at a cost and risk acceptable to the American people? And I think that failure has diminished our will as our announced plans to withdraw, these constant announcements that, hey, we're leaving. Okay, now we're really leaving. Is that affects the will of our partners and our allies, neutrals, as well as our enemies in a way that cuts against our effectiveness in these wars.
So to achieve these goals that you laid out, was a long list of things, and you talk a lot in the book about your experience in one town, Tal Afar, where you engaged in counterinsurgency in both using force and also the political dimension very skillfully over building coalitions and using intelligence and doing the hard work on the ground step by step to try to rebuild a society. And I guess your point is that if we're not willing to do those things over a very extended period and until the outcomes that you want are achieved, that we shouldn't do the war in the first place. But having started the war and removed the regime in an area that had so little infrastructure and so many deep-seated rivalries and tensions, the price tag in life and treasure and time and basically national effort it consumed, 6 years of the Bush in the last 6 years of the Bush administration. The question is the American public ever really going to be willing and able to essentially agree to that level of cost? Because the efforts seem to be so great and the outcomes so uncertain, and so much questions about our capabilities to transform these societies. And you kind of prescribe that in your book, not only for Iraq, but really for the many places in the Middle East that have dysfunctional governments, failed states. So I came away from part of those chapters feeling, well, this makes a lot of sense, but can we do tall offer across the whole MENA region? And what would the cost be for that kind of program?
Yeah. Well, I think, David, it all depends on leadership, and it depends on competence, and it depends on the effectiveness of strategy. I argue in the book, I hope persuasively, that our short-term mentality, as it was applied to Afghanistan and in Iraq, the light footprint approach in Afghanistan, in Iraq, remember General Tommy Franks went around immediately after the collapse of the regime and said, take as much risk getting out as you did getting in. Okay. What does that mean, right? And so I think that there was this short-term mentality that paradoxically lengthened and complicated the wars and increased the costs associated with them. Of course, I was living it, so I had a bit of a personal view of these policies and strategies developed. I think what I would say on fantasy in Washington that just were inconsistent with reality on the ground. I tell the story of a conversation with my good friend and often sidekick on these missions in Afghanistan and Iraq, Joel Rayburn, is now at the State Department. And I said, hey, Joel, why is this happening? So, well, the problem is that we are in Iraq and the strategies and policies are developed in Washington for MyRaq. And MyRaq can be whatever you want it to be. And we, I think, went from ignorance at the beginning of the invasion of Iraq to denial that there was even insurgency. Remember, we couldn't even say the I word. When we were in the midst of fighting an insurgency, and then we had, I think, a period of slow realization of what we were up against, a period of adaptation in terms of the surge, and then the premature abandonment of what was a really very small and sustainable effort in Iraq in December 2011. When Vice President Biden calls up President Obama and says, "Thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war," think about the assumption that underpins that phone call. It's like, hey, wars end when one side decides to disengage. And then, of course, what we see less than 3 years later is ISIS in control of territory the size of Britain. So, I think that we have to make the case to the American people. Leaders haven't done that, I don't think, across multiple administrations. They haven't described to the American people what's at stake. Why should you care? And then what is a strategy that will deliver an outcome, as you suggest, David, at a cost and risk acceptable to them? And I think that lack of leadership reflects a lack of competence in our approach to these conflicts. I believe, and I write about this in the book, that the first time we had, I think, a sound and sustainable strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia broadly was the one the president announced in August of 2017. Of course, we've abandoned that, and we've actually replicated and then exceeded the fundamental flaws in the approach to that problem set that associated with the Obama administration. And so when people say, hey, it's been a 20-year long war, it hasn't been. It's been a 1-year war, 19 or 20 times over.
And when you're in the discussions about this, how do you, and I think these are instincts that both President Trump and Obama shared to some extent, and you're advocating for these, long-term it's really nation building kind of activities when they say, what about nation building in Detroit? And what about nation building in Eastern North Carolina? And, you know, we don't have a great track record. Maybe your point is that we don't have a great track record because we never really tried of actually achieving these.
I wouldn't say we never tried. I just think we did it incompetently.
Badly. Okay.
Yeah. And David, so I would say,
why should the American people be confident that we can achieve those kinds of goals in these
they have
foreign countries and that have, you know, Afghanistan, that's so little development and so on? Why should we feel confident that if we committed and did the things that you said, that we'd actually be able to achieve those outcomes?
Well, first of all, you know, Afghanistan doesn't need to be Denmark, David. You know, it just needs to be Afghanistan, right? And so the narrative now on Afghanistan was, hey, we just couldn't do it. We lost. Well, actually, what if the narrative was, no, actually we won, and we won because the Taliban is deposed. The Afghan government, even despite the all the complications and the low turnout in the last election, was democratically elected. 90% or greater of the population don't want the Taliban to come back. There is violence in the country. Afghanistan is going to be a violent place, maybe for the foreseeable future. But large swaths of the country are not under Taliban control. The Taliban can't use it as a way to host, as a place to host terrorist groups, 20 of which we know are designated U.S. terrorist groups in that area, you know, who already want to continue to commit mass murder in their war against all civilization. I think we should recognize, hey, this is kind of a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization, and it's worth the effort to support those who bear the brunt of the fight. You know, we had a very small number of troops in Afghanistan today and in recent months and years even. And I think it's worth remembering it is not without cost. I mean, we had 10 of our soldiers make the ultimate sacrifice this year in Afghanistan, but 30 Afghan soldiers on average are killed every day fighting to maintain the freedoms that they earned since 2001. And for those of us who care about humanity and have humanitarian concerns, why don't we just ask the question, what does power sharing with somebody like the Taliban look like? I mean, is that mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school bulldozed? So the stakes are high and they're demonstrable, I would say, David. This is not a theoretical case, right? Those who are advocating for a withdrawal from Afghanistan are advocating for the Clinton counterterrorism policy against Al Qaeda, which is to fire a few cruise missiles in 1998 and call it a day. Okay, what happened after that? The most devastating terrorist attack in history. What happened after ISIS took over territory the size of Great Britain? Multiple attacks in Europe, multiple failed attempts in the United States, the shoot down of a Russian airliner. I mean, we could go on about this, right? It's not a theoretical case. But to your point, who's making that case? Our leaders aren't making that case. And so the argument that you laid out is like, why are we there? You know, isn't that just a mess to be avoided? I mean, I'm not unsympathetic to people thinking that, but the book is in large measure an effort to explain why it's important and how we can accomplish an outcome in terms of securing our own country at a cost that's acceptable. I think, you know, this might be, I don't know if this analogy works, but if COVID has taught us anything, it should be that threats to our security, you know, that develop abroad, once they reach our shores, can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost, right? It is much more effective to be able to contain those threats before they penetrate our shores. And the argument I make in the last chapter of the book in New Arenas of Competition is, hey, you know, C. Vann Woodward, a great historian, you know, he wrote in 1962, the age of free security was over at the beginning of the 20th century. And those who argue for retrenchment, you know, for coming back to our shores and just, why don't we just invest it all at home and in homeland security? They're behind the times, David. You know? And I think that mentality is dangerous and ultimately will pay the price for it if it triumphs.
Well, I could talk about this issue all day, but I think we should touch on as many issues as we can. And I know we'll get great questions from the students as well. But let's turn to China, because the relationship with China, the competition with China is going to affect everybody on this call. And the younger you are, the longer it's going to affect your lives. And I want to pull at the historian thread in you and talk. And you argue that the first thing we really have to do is understand China's long view of history and its position as a great power that was repressed by the West, and that it's now moving to a place where it is taking its rightful place in the constellation of nations.
I would say, David, just a quick clarification. I would say repressed by Mao Zedong, who murdered tens of millions of people. I mean,
but it's the Chinese.
I would not buy into the century of humiliation narrative that the party's putting out. I would qualify it at least.
Right, but it's that we need to understand that that's how China views history. That's
Sure.
that through their lens that they. I'm not saying that's what history tells us, but that's how China, and we have to understand that view of history in order to figure out what our policy should be. So, if that's the lesson that you draw, or if that's or you can explain the historical narrative, but. What lessons do we draw from history to develop strategy? And if you can talk about the linkage there.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I mean, this is the methodology I use in the book as a historian. Okay, it's as my daughters would say, hashtag predictable. Right? Is that I think that understanding how at least the recent past produced the present is the first and an essential step to making a projection into the future. So in each of these chapters, I try to explore that history to reveal what's driving this challenge. What is the nature of this challenge? And again, to pay particular attention to the ideology and emotions and aspirations that drive and constrain the other. And what I conclude in the China chapters is that China is driven really by two fundamental emotions. Fear, first of all, fear of losing control. And this is the Chinese Communist Party's obsession with control and preventing chaos. And you see it in their actions even more dramatically now during the pandemic to extend and tighten the party's exclusive grip on power by perfecting this. I'm going to use a string of adjectives here: a technologically enabled Orwellian surveillance police state. How's that for excessive adjectives?
I lived in China for 6 months as a faculty at our university there, and I experienced it firsthand. The number of my photographs that the Chinese government has is probably a very high number. It's very evident and very oppressive. There's no doubt about that.
And of course, it also includes a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang. I mean, Uyghur birth rates are down 60%, based on the putting people in the concentration camps, and also there have been forced abortions, forced contraception, and IUDs, for example, placed in women. It's really a horrible tragedy. And then you see the extension of that, obviously, in Hong Kong now with the National Security Act and the repression of human freedom there. There is even more draconian action being undertaken now against international reporters to be thrown out of the country. There have been capricious detainment of foreigners, the two Canadian hostages, the two Mikes in particular, and then I think what you've seen is anybody who has the temerity to criticize the party at all is being treated in a very harsh manner these days, with one of Xi Jinping's greatest critics just being sentenced to 18 years in prison just last week. So why are they doing this? Well, I mean, they fear losing control because the party is incentivized to maintain the power structure in the country. What they fear more than anything else is that the Chinese people will think that maybe they should have a say in how they're governed. And then they're also driven, though, by ambition, which is tied to maintaining this control. And this is the narrative of national rejuvenation, and as you alluded to, taking center stage in the world. And China is pursuing this national rejuvenation to meet the rising expectations of the population, to meet the narrative of what they're fed in constant propaganda, right? I mean, if you watch Chinese news, right, it's 15 minutes. I don't speak Chinese, but this is from translated versions and then talking to those who know China much better than I do. 15 minutes of how great and wise the party's leaders are, 15 minutes of the great accomplishments under the various Chinese Communist Party strategies, and 15 minutes about how screwed up the West is, and how screwed up America is and democracy is, and so forth. And China is engaged in a very sophisticated campaign to establish exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific and to challenge the U.S. and the free world globally. They're doing that under really a strategy that I describe as in the book as co-option. Co-opt you in, by U.S. businesses, for example, by access to China's lucrative market, or the lure of short-term profits there, and with investments and so forth, and then also also the lure to countries of Chinese investment back in their countries, and the so-called setting of the debt trap, and then to use that after you're co-opted to coerce you. I mean, ask the NBA, right, about coercion, to adhere to China's worldview, and to support China's policies internationally, and then you've seen this undercutting of international organizations like the World Health Organization, UNESCO, Human Rights Council, the list goes on, ICAO, and then concealment, to conceal all these activities. All this is just normal business practices, and we have to be alert to this, because if China succeeds, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. We have to compete more effectively, and these strategies that we ought to be concerned about are the military civil fusion strategy, the One Belt, One Road strategy. We can talk more about any of these if you like, and then Made in China 2025. But I think it is past time for the free world to recognize that we have to compete. I just want to address quickly, and I'm not going on too long about this, but China's a big topic, is that I think there are three fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of the competition with China. The first of these is that, hey, this is a US-China problem. And kind of a permutation of that is, it's just because Donald Trump is so mean, right? that Xi Jinping is acting out this way. But look at what China's done. They have foisted COVID-19 on the world, right? They suppressed the news of human-to-human transmission. They punished the doctors that were trying to raise the alarm about it. They shut down domestic travel before international travel. They subverted the WTO and got the WTO to buy their line. I could go on, right? But then they add insult to injury, but with this wolf warrior diplomacy in the midst of the pandemic. And then what do we see lately? As I think Xi Jinping thinks he's emerging from the pandemic in a position of relative advantage. What you see is, as I mentioned, national security law, repression of human freedom in Hong Kong, intensification of this cultural genocide in Xinjiang, and a speech he gave said, hey, the Uyghurs love it. They love being in concentration camps. In fact, we're going to build a few additions onto the ones that we have now. And then you have the bludgeoning of Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier. You have increasingly aggressive actions in the South China Sea in what would be, so to speak, the largest land grab in history. You have the constant threats to Taiwan, to Japan, especially around the Senkakus. I mean, I could go on about this. Massive cyber attacks against us, Australia, other medical research facilities around the world during a pandemic. Okay, is this a US-China problem? It sounds to me like it's a free world China problem. The second myth is that there's not international cooperation on this. There is actually a high degree of international cooperation. I could talk more about that if you want later on, but I think we need to magnify it, right? If the world's largest economies work together on all these issues, especially around Chinese economic aggression, that is the U.S., Japan, EU, and others, it's going to be tough for the Chinese Communist Party to prevail in these competitions if we get our act together and we do it right. And then the third, but there is cooperation going on. And the third is around this interpretation of the Thucydides trap. One of the biggest Chinese Communist Party talking points is, you're the status quo power. You're just trying to keep us down. We're just a rising people. No, this is about the policies and actions of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think we have to recognize China is not monolithic. It's not homogeneous. We need to maximize positive contacts that we can have with the Chinese people and entities that are not acting at the behest of the party. But sadly, David, that space it's shrinking. It's shrinking. And so I reject this idea that we have this false choice to make of either passivity toward China or a disastrous war, right? I mean, there's a lot we can do in between those extremes.
Well, you put a lot on the table there, but I would like a taste of how we engage in this competition, and maybe we could talk about it in terms of the Huawei issue. When we started out, we were definitely not aligned with Europe, but Europe is beginning to come around on Huawei. But that also shows how, in many ways, some of the lack of building and fostering and promoting our alliances during the last 4 years is coming back to bite us on China policy. As you point out, the free world needs to be aligned here. And that does show a lot of the value of alliances, and also the issue with the Asia Trade Pact, which fell apart. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit more and give us just maybe one or two ideas about how does this competition, how do we engage in this competition without leading to some sort of military conflict?
Well, it's really the chapter in the book is entitled "Turning Weakness into Strength," and so what I think we should do, just from a broad kind of intellectual approach to this, is to say, hey, what does the Chinese Communist Party fear, right? And what do they see as weaknesses in their own society? Actually, if we answer that question, those are our competitive advantages. What do they fear? They fear freedom of speech and freedom of information. I mean, I think investigative journalism is one of the most powerful antidotes, to what China's doing in the area, for example, of sustained industrial espionage, or what they're doing in the area of the debt trap, right? Indebting countries to create servile relationships, which one journalist in Africa called it a new form of colonialism. So I think that, so strengthen our freedom of the press and authoritative sources of information for us in the free world. And then maybe try to penetrate the firewall to give the Chinese people access to different sources of information other than what the party feeds them, which is a great deal of propaganda and disinformation. They fear rule of law, right? Because rule of law would challenge the rule of the party, and so strengthening rule of law in our own country, but in others, other free and open societies, democratic governments that want to strengthen rule of law within their countries, our efforts and others' efforts to do that is one of the best ways to defend against the aggression of the Chinese Communist Party and the export of their authoritarian and mercantilist model. The other aspects of our democracy have to do just fundamentally with democratic principles and institutions and processes, right? I mean, what the Chinese Communist Party fears the most is that if their people would have the temerity of suggesting that maybe they should have a say in how they're governed, right? This is I think important for us to not go around the world promoting our form of democracy, but in countries that want to strengthen their democratic institutions and processes, we ought to lend a helping hand as we strengthen our own. So I think that's one way to think about it. Also, our entrepreneurial spirit is our strength, our ability to create, our ability to innovate, our ability to conduct research and development, not just in government programs, but across the private sector. Now, that strength of ours has been dissipated because of the People's Liberation Army and the Ministry of State Security's infiltration of a lot of those activities to exfiltrate sensitive intelligence or sensitive technologies and intellectual property back to China to redound to their benefit and to apply directly to their defense programs as well as their surveillance police state. So, I mean, I think we have tremendous opportunities, David, just by acknowledging it's a competition. We vacated arenas of competition based on the fundamental assumption, and this is an element of the theme that runs through the book associated with strategic narcissism, that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, would liberalize its economy as it prospered, and would liberalize its form of government. Okay, it's quite clear now that the opposite is the case. And so the strategy of cooperation engagement is not only no longer valid, it's actually dangerous, because China was emboldened by our failure to compete effectively. And when I say our, I mean the free world.
Well, I want to welcome students and all participants to put some questions in the chat, and we'll start compiling a list. I could talk to General McMaster for quite some time, where we want to bring everybody into the discussion. But let me ask you a quick question about the pandemic. And actually, this isn't what I had planned to talk about on the pandemic, but listening to you today, was your book written for a pre-pandemic world where the United States economy was going like gangbusters, where we've now laid, or we're probably going to lay, you know, $5 trillion on the debt on the credit card if we put through another package? United States people are going to be very inward focused. There's been less discussion about foreign policy in this presidential election than any in my lifetime that I can remember. Are you concerned that the leader of the free world is going to be very inward focused as we emerge from this pandemic in 2021, 2022, and these problems are going to get worse before they can get better?
Yeah, I am concerned about that, David, and I think that I mean, obviously there is a period of introspection that we are long overdue for, especially, you know, in the wake of the triple crises, as you mentioned, the pandemic, the recession, the divisions in our society laid bare by George Floyd's murder, and the growing concerns of inequality of opportunity and unequal treatment under the law. And I mean, okay, I mean, it's time for us to think about how we strengthen our own society and restore confidence in who we are as a people and in our democracy. So that's all important, good work that has to happen, but it can't be done at the expense of attention to these crucial challenges abroad. And the argument that I make in the book is, hey, they're not going to go away. I mean, to paraphrase what is attributed to Trotsky, right? You might not be interested, you know, in crucial challenges to our security and prosperity that originate abroad, you know, but they're interested in you, right? We're going to have to cope with them. COVID, as I mentioned, is just one example of how disengagement can lead to much more severe consequences and higher costs, right? So I think that our leaders will have to try their best to transcend this inward focus, which would reinforce this effect of narcissism, right? To define the world as we'd like it to be. We just wish those problems would go away. But sadly, David, I would say that all of the competitions that I write about in the book have not been ameliorated by COVID-19. They've in fact been catalyzed by it. I mentioned what occurred with China. I would say you could say the same with Russia, right? Hey, this was supposed to be a big year for old Vladimir Putin. I write about this in the book about how it came crashing down around him because of COVID, the collapse of oil prices, you know, the fact that his extension in rule till 2036 was supposed to be very celebrated, but instead, you know, there were protests in the eastern part of the country and general discontent about his role. What is he doing about it? You know, I think he's becoming more aggressive internally to consolidate power. The poisoning of Navalny, case in point, and then also externally as well. He's fighting proxy wars and supporting the serial episodes of mass homicide in the Syrian civil war. He's supporting Haftar's forces in Libya in a way that's perpetuating that destructive conflict, and he's infiltrating brigades of little green men into Belarus as we speak. So, you know, I think. I could go on about this in the Middle East. I just can go around the book if you want, but I want to stop because I really want to hear where you'd like to take the discussion. So to answer your question is, heck no, those challenges aren't going away. COVID has catalyzed them, and we take our eye off of these challenges at our own peril.
Okay. Yeah, I have, as I said, I'd love to have an even more extended conversation, as much of a treat as this is. But let's get some students in. One student of mine currently, Mark Lucido, active duty U.S. Army. Mark, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Professor Schanzer, and thank you, General McMaster, for being with us here today and lending us your expertise. My question stems from the strike on Qasem Soleimani. And I was wondering if you could first lay out what you think the greatest strategic impact or risk from this action was. And second, if you could lay out any long-term concerns, perhaps unrealized, that you might have, whether they be legal, strategic, diplomatic, or military. And then if I might ask a follow-up, is do you believe that the Soleimani strike strengthened or weakened our position for containment or coexistence with Iran?
Okay, Mark. Hey, well, I'll just begin by saying coexistence isn't going to happen as long as as long as the Islamic Republic is run by the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, and the IRGC. What I write about in the book is really this element of strategic narcissism, in which we believe that the Republicans or the reformists in Iraq are going to prevail over the revolutionaries. Hey, that fight went on for a while, but hey, the revolutionaries won. They won, and they're in charge. And sometimes they put forward the shop window of their foreign minister or of their of Rouhani. But I describe in the book how our policy, if you can characterize our overall policy since 1979, has been one generally of conciliation. Immediately after the revolution, we sent the National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski to Algeria to meet with the new government's foreign minister. Then they took the hostages. During the Iran-Iraq war, really at the end of that Iran-Iraq war, and after the tanker war, we thought, hey, maybe we could get an opening to Iran with arms sales. This is the Iran-Contra affair, or that part of it. After we decided not to retaliate after the mass murder attacks on our embassy and the Marine barracks in Lebanon, retaliate against even Hezbollah, or these groups that morphed into Hezbollah, or against Iran directly. After Iran went global with terrorist attacks in Europe, in Argentina, in Panama, we didn't really impose any costs on Iran during that period of time in the early 90s. And after the Khobar Towers bombing in 96, we said, oh, well, we got this new president there, Khatami. He was a librarian. How could he be that bad, right? So let's not impose any costs on Iran for that. And then, then I'll just fast forward to killing through their proxies over 600 Americans in Iraq. And what do? Nothing. So yeah, I think the strike against Soleimani in the wake of an attack he orchestrated on our embassy, other attacks that killed Americans, and the fact he was on a trip at the time to pull together more offensive operations against us, I would call that the righteous use of violence to defend our nation and our interests abroad. He has more blood on his hands, I think, than any other human being that was living until he and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes were killed in that strike. I believe that we'll never know, really. I mean, if that restored deterrence. I think that doing nothing would have been the riskiest course of action. So that's my perspective on it. I would have wanted to do it much earlier, Mark, to answer your question directly.
Okay, we have Ashil Javari. Or do we? Let's get Randy Farrell on deck then. Randy. Either of you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please ask your question.
Hi, sorry. So I was just wondering, how do you think we can practice the strategic empathy that you outline in the book with China, right? Because it seems like a lot of the rhetoric that many leaders of that have been voicing is similar to arguments, that the book criticizes for being strategically narcissist, like an authoritarian power, like abusing its own people, and that it's a threat to the world, et cetera. So like, what can the U.S. do different this time with regards to China when we're kind of dealing, when taking the lessons that you're kind of outlining in the book?
Ashil, thank you. I think that is strategic empathy. Empathy is not sympathy, Ashil. I don't think we should be sympathetic with the Chinese Communist Party. And I think you're probably talking about something very Chinese that the administration did with the 4 speeches, right, of Christopher Wray and Secretary Pompeo and the Attorney General and gosh, who else gave a speech there? But anyway, it was and O'Brien, National Security Advisor. I think those and the speech by Matt Pottinger that he gave in Mandarin are exactly what we ought to be doing. We need to call out their behavior. We need to pull the curtain back on what they're doing. As I mentioned, this is their strategy is one of co-option, coercion, and concealment. And for a long time, Ashil, the way that they advanced Chinese interest and influence in the West was really through 2 main means. First was what was co-opt elites. Co-opt elites, get them to be your people in the West, and the second was dominate the narrative. They've become much more sophisticated lately. They're taking pages out of the Russian playbook on cyber-enabled information warfare. But I think that those speeches were good examples of communicating to not just the American public, because a lot of times, Americans don't pay attention, as David was saying, to foreign policy, especially in the midst of a pandemic. But I think those were important speeches that were carefully read and discussed internationally. And I would say, especially across the Indo-Pacific region and in Europe as well. So I think, I think they're wholly consistent with strategic empathy, because what they did is they explored what is the ideology, and what are the emotions and aspirations that drive and constrain the Chinese Communist Party, and what is at stake for us? Why do we care about it, and what do we have to do to ensure that we protect against various forms of Chinese Communist Party aggression?
Okay, we have Randy Farrell, a U.S. Army National Security Fellow here, studying with us for 2 semesters. We're very lucky to have her.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time. And you somewhat touched on the narrative at this point, but how does the U.S. effectively compete in today's information environment in support of our national interests? As a national security advisor, you had a lead for diplomacy, you had a lead for military, and a lead for economics, but not one for information. What type of national security messaging capability is needed? Something similar to the U.S. Information Agency or something like that, with law, structure, and resourcing to effectively message?
Gosh, Randy, that's a great question. I mean, we have talked about this for so long. I mean, after 9/11, and I'm sure, David, everybody, you all remember, how many times we've had these discussions about how do we get better at it? How do we get better at it? I think that we have the Global Engagement Center at State. I mean, I'm sure they're doing their best. We have little spots of excellence, in terms of broadcasts that reach foreign audiences. But I think what we have to try to do is to open it up more, open up access within authoritarian regimes, to give people just an alternative source of information. I think that there's much that we can do to defend ourselves against cyber-enabled information warfare against us, right? We are, in many ways, Randy, we're losing the war because, our adversaries are on the offensive in this area. And this is, so-called Russian new generation warfare, what I call in the book Putin's playbook of disruption, disinformation, and denial. I try to use alliteration as a memory, as a memory trick. But the disinformation part of it, we're so susceptible to it because of the divisions that already exist in our society. I think it's worth remembering that in the 2016 attack on our elections, 80% of the bot and troll traffic from the IRA was on issues of race, to polarize us on issues of race. A distant second and third were gun control and immigration, right? So what they want to do is polarize us, pit us against each other, and weaken our confidence in who we are. Then the other aspect of this is our media, right? Our media is in many ways caught up in this political polarization. I mean, it's really, I think, a sad state of affairs that if for many Americans, if they lean to one side politically, they're going to watch this cable news station. If they lean to the other side, they're going to watch, another combination of cable news stations. And then, of course, it's magnified by the pseudo media, by conspiracy theories that operate in that pseudo media, and by social media, and the avarice of these companies and the algorithms associated with the business model that is aimed at getting more clicks and more advertising money by showing more and more extreme content to people and pulling us further and further apart from each other. So I would say, hey, first of all, we need a good defense. I think we put into place, when I was running the process for those 13 months in Washington, a number of new policies and mechanisms to defend ourselves better. The cyber infrastructure security effort is much stronger. There's a new organization with really good people working hard to secure our cyber infrastructure and election now infrastructure in particular. That work is paid off. We should have confidence in our election infrastructure. The second area was in cyber, in the cyber domain, and a recognition that a good defense requires a good offense. I can't go into more detail than that, but if you contrast, 2018, there's a significant contrast between 2018 and 2016. We're even better now, I think, in 2020. So that aspect of it is better. But in terms of in terms of reaching foreign audiences with the right messages, we do have to get better. If you have ideas, let me know, and I'll help champion them. But I think it has to be, someone in charge of an organization that is held responsible for doing a better job in this area and has the tools and resources necessary, and that we have measures of effectiveness that we can track over time and adapt over time. But we're at a disadvantage here. But what we have to do is obviously magnify the advantages we do have with our free press, and with free press I mean international press in democratic countries.
Well, before we go to our next question, let me make a couple announcements. Let General McMaster get a drink of water. Upcoming AGS events in general, you're welcome to zoom in on any that you would find interesting. On October 19th, so next Monday at 5 p.m., a perspective on diversity in the intelligence community, a conversation with former CIA official Melvin Gamble. We're looking forward to that. Part of our AGS Focus on Israel series, we have a talk entitled Shared Society, Perspective of Israeli Arabs, a conversation with Mohammed Darwashi. And that's going to be the following Monday, October 26th at noon, because our guest is in Israel. And then as part of our, and you definitely like this, General, History and International Security series, To Build a Better World, a conversation with Phillips, who I'm sure you know, on Monday, November 9th at 5:30. So some very rich and wonderful events coming up. If you'd like more information about AGS events or sign up for our newsletter, visit our website, ags.duke.edu, email Melanie Benson, or use a link that has been posted in the chat box. Very good. Let's go to Caroline Davidson.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes,
I
we can. Go ahead.
apologize. Wonderful.
ahead,
Sorry. Sir, this is a terrific opportunity for us in particular. I teach for an NDU master's degree program on Fort Bragg. Some of my SOF students are listening in this evening, and we are very fortunate to be able to connect with TIS for many of these events. I am working with them on a survey of American history right now, and we obviously try to use the past to illuminate contemporary problems. I often find my students get frustrated by the fact that they don't feel history offers them many solutions. So what guidance do you have for students of history who are also driven to improve their understanding of the present, particularly in their careers? And is there a period you recommend they study more closely? Thank you.
Okay, well, history is not going to give you the answer to contemporary problems, right? But it can help you think more clearly about those problems, and it can help you ask the right questions. It can help you be sensitive to previous experiences that are relevant to contemporary problems, so you can avoid at least the same pitfalls. And I think the advice of Sir Michael Howard is probably the best in this area, especially in the area of military history. For your Special Operations Forces students, I think they should read the essay, The Use and Abuse of Military History by Michael Howard, in which he argues that we should study history, and I think this applies beyond military history to diplomatic history and other disciplines, sub-disciplines within the historical profession, is to study history in width, so you can get a sense for changes over time, big shifts in the nature of society and how that affects armed conflict, for example, if you're studying military history, in depth. And to study history in depth, so you can look at, in military history, a particular campaign or battle, and you see the complex causality of events. I think that's really important, that history alerts you to the complex causality of events, and you recognize the human, the psychological, the emotional dimension, especially of combat, by studying in depth. And then in context in our case of our democratic form of government and civil military relations, civil control over the military, popular will, as we've been talking about, as David was asking some questions associated with popular will. So I think you can't go wrong studying history in width, depth, and in context, and to recognize that, again, as Sir Michael Howard says, that an old professor, that professor is not going to accompany you as you matriculate and go on with your life. but hopefully what you learned from that professor will help illuminate your way. And I think that's what history helps us do. I write about this in the conclusion a little bit. I draw on Margaret Macmillan's work, which is great on this. David Hackett Fisher has a great book, as I'm sure you're aware, Historians' Fallacies as well. Thinking in Time is a classic. I mean, there's a genre on this, what history can do. I will, and David, I'll just preface this by saying some of my best friends are political scientists. I love political scientists. I mean, I even like Peter Feaver, but
Okay, well, now you've crossed the line.
what I'd like to say is, I think that security studies that are too heavy in theory tend to oversimplify causality. And I think they're part of the problem in our lack of strategic competence. I think a historical inquiry really highlights the effect of contingency and uncertainty, and again, this multiple causality, and to do so, to make these inquiries without the burden of a theory. And so I think, I'm a fan of historical inquiry. I also see, the importance of theoretical constructs to help us think clearly about problem sets. But I think what history does actually, the study of history can help you develop your own theory of foreign policy and strategy. And really, I think the book in some ways is a reflection of how that's evolved for me over the years. It was a continuation of my self-education. And in each of the chapters, I learned a lot more. At the end of the book, I don't think my book should be the last word on anything. I have a list of recommended readings for each of the parts of the book as well.
I'm really glad we got a chance to answer that question, because it's such an interesting, important one. One of the benefits of our COVID setup is that our alumni get to participate in our events much more easily. And so I want to invite John Hillen, a AGS alum, and a supporter of our program, to ask a question.
Hi, HR. Can you hear me okay?
Hey, John. Great to at least see your name emblazoned on my screen. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Great to see you. So I wrote a piece that's up on FPRI's website. And thank you. You're a new trustee. Thank you for joining the board. But I talk about the different foreign policy visions of our two candidates. And I wonder in there if a President Biden, if elected, can return us to a more conventional World War II, post-World War II consensus about American leadership in the world and American leadership of the institutions that we helped set up and have dominated for the past 70 years, or if he'll be challenged to return us to that consensus. I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Has the world moved on, in other words, from our post-World War II foreign policy consensus?
No. Well, John, I think in short, yes, it has. And there are new forms of competition and new threats to, the international order, however you define it. But I think that it would be a big mistake to try to turn the clock back, especially to turn the clock back, I would say, to 2016 when if it is President Biden in January when he was vice president, because I think that there have been some very important shifts in foreign policy that ought to be continued by any administration. I'll have to tell you, John, on the national security strategy of 2017, I think we wrote this from a nonpartisan perspective. As you know, Donald Trump may be offensive to a lot of people, but he's not really like an ideologue on foreign policy. In fact, in many ways, his impulses are more along the lines of retrenchment, and seem to be more in line with Obama administration policies, especially on the Middle East and Afghanistan. Now, I disagree with that, okay, but I think that he didn't come in with like an ideological agenda. He did come in with, as each administration has recently, with an almost emotional drive to define their foreign policy in opposition to their predecessor. What I write about in the book is how I think the Obama administration was driven in large measure by the president's opposition to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and tended to see foreign policy largely through the lens of that opposition to that policy decision. I think President Trump, of course, he came in, anything that was Obama, he didn't like it and so forth. But I think we have to break that cycle. I really do. And so I hope that viewers who are interested will go to the highly readable December 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States. And what I think is, a Biden administration could just do a word search for America First, take that out of there. And it's a rational, I think, and principled approach to our foreign policy. I think there's no turning the clock back on China, for example, John, and then on international organizations, which you mentioned, and defending the liberal order. We have threats that are new, and especially the subversion of the Chinese Communist Party, of those organizations, right? And I rapid fire went through some of them, from the International Civil Aviation Organization to the WHO to the Human Rights Council to, you name it. China tried to get the leadership of the international body that governs intellectual property, and patents. I mean, talking about like the fox in the hen house, right? So I think what we have to recognize from an internationalist perspective, and I don't, hopefully nobody's upset about this, there is no such thing as global governance. I mean, we should probably, just say, hey, that's something to maybe dream about, but it just is a fantasy. We have to be able to compete if we want sensible international approaches to problems that know no borders, that we have to work on from an international perspective. We have to compete. There is no prize for membership in these organizations. We have to work together with like-minded countries to make sure these organizations are not subverted or used against the very purpose for which they were founded. This is what China is trying to do. I think on issues of environment, I'm a little bit concerned that if it is a Biden administration, there may be some who are so concerned about climate change, as we all should be, that they make compromises with China for the false promise of China making progress on carbon emissions, for example, when they're building 70 coal-fired plants a year. So Xi Jinping gives a great speech, says environment a bunch of times, and everybody says, oh gosh, that's great. Well, it's not true. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize that these are competitions. If we are going to reduce carbon emissions, as an example, if we are going to take on these interconnected problems, and I write about this in the book, of climate, energy, food security, water security, health security, we need real solutions, and we need to advance those with like-minded partners, and recognize that there are those who are not going to readily sign up, for the program. And we have to compete with them. They're not waiting around to be led by us. So thanks for the question, John. And I look forward to reading the essay. I'll look it up.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. Gia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Gia.
Hi, sir. Thanks for being here tonight. My question for you relates to cybersecurity. Which do you not fear more, but what concerns you more? A cyber attack on our infrastructure and systems, or the psychological warfare that's happening on social media over time?
Wow. Okay. Gosh, Gia, can I say both? I think both, right? I think both. And I think we have to take, there are obviously different remedies for both of those problem sets, right? One is in part, a good defense combined with a good offense to protect infrastructure, the need to design systems that are more resilient, to degrade gracefully rather than fail catastrophically, to have backup systems. I think to share capacity with like-minded countries. So maybe an attack on one is an attack on all, in cyber infrastructure, and how that connects to different aspects of our infrastructure, from the financial infrastructure to power to transportation and so forth. So I think that, I think that's a grave danger. We shouldn't underestimate it. But what I'm concerned more about, like right now, Gia, is the divisions in our own society, and the way that social media. I don't know if you saw the Netflix show Social Experiment. It's really well done. I think I drew a lot in my book on Neil Ferguson's work from the Tower and the Square, who saw this coming like way before a lot of other people, into connection with the degree to which social media is driving us apart from one another. So, hey, what I write about in the book, Gia, is the need for an educated population, and the need for all of us to take ownership of this. I think Duke University, this program, it's a great example of bringing people together from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and to talk about the challenges that we face. I think if you're in local organizations, community groups. I mean, we just need to come together as Americans and restore our confidence in our common identity to lessen these divisions. I mean, I'm biased. I work with Zoom now. So this is not a commercial announcement, but I mean, I love apps like this, conferencing apps, because they bring people together for conversations, right? Instead of tweeting at each other, we can actually have a conversation together. And so at a time when we can't meet on basketball courts and rugby pitches and everything else, I think that that the time is right for us to just reach out to as many people as we can, to have respectful and civil discussions about the challenges we face domestically and internationally, and just come together as Americans, bound together by the common purpose, right? Don't we all want a better future for generations to come? We ought to be able to work on at least what we can agree on.
Well, unfortunately, we're coming to a close. There's, I think, 45 unanswered questions, which is a testament to the tour de force that we've heard and how much intellectual firepower is behind, is speaking to us today. So sorry we can't get to everybody's questions. I have a quick question at the end. We have an election coming up. You're a former general and you're retired now, but I'm wondering if you were going to vote, because we've heard that some generals don't vote. Based on the civil theory of civil military relations. And if you are going to vote, are you going to tell the public who you're going to vote for and why or why not?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, David. I am going to vote for the first time in my life, David. So I went into West Point when I was 17. I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I had read a biography of George Marshall when I was in high school. And I followed his example. I don't expect other officers or soldiers to do that. I think people should vote, do what you want to do. But I thought this was a way for me to remain studiously apolitical. Now, as a retired officer, I'm going to vote, but heck no, I'm not going to tell anybody how I'm going to vote. And I registered as an independent. And I think it's really important to keep that bold line in place, right? Between our military and our political process. Our founders understood the danger, right? George Washington's grandparents fled the English Civil War. He knew this was this could be a problem. And I'm concerned, David, that this goes back to old Sam Huntington and objective and subjective control, right? Our profession has a big responsibility in remaining apolitical, but so do politicians. And I've seen politicians on both sides of the spectrum try to drag the military into partisan politics. That's a danger to our democracy, and they ought to just stop, right? And these dueling lists of generals and admirals. Yeah, I respect my former colleagues' decisions if they want to sign whatever they want to sign, endorse whoever they want to endorse. But I just think we ought to recognize it comes with a danger, right? We want everybody to volunteer to serve in our armed forces. Service in our armed forces is incredibly rewarding. By the way, it's a great correction to the divisions we see, because everybody comes into the military in different backgrounds, different biases, different prejudices, and you see it all melt away when they're part of a team that's committed to a mission bigger than themselves, a team that is willing to bound together by a sense of honor and willingness to sacrifice for each other, right? And so I think we want people from all political parties, all races, religions, creeds, sexual orientations, to serve in our military. And to bring that experience back out with them as citizens as well. So there are many dangers, I think, of dragging the military into partisanship, and I think we just ought to be cognizant of them and protect against them. And our politicians have to be wary of it as well.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end. Let me extend my thanks, as President Price did, to the Phillips family for making this event and many past events with our very top national security thinkers and strategists. And we're so grateful to the Phillips family for their support. General McMaster, I made a big mistake when I left my home this morning, is that I forgot to bring my AGS t-shirt with me to show you what is going to be coming in the mail for your 75 plus minutes of labor this afternoon. To say it's a small token of our appreciation would be one of the greatest understatements possible. But I assume you still do PT every morning, and so you're going to have an AGS American Grand Strategy t-shirt to do your exercise in. And many of your former national security advisors, your alumni group, have these already. We'd love a picture if you could get together and wear the HS t-shirts. That would be great for our program. We couldn't be more grateful. Thank you for your time, and thank you. The book has been put up on the chat room, a link to purchase the book. It's called Battlegrounds, Fighting, I'm sorry. It's called Battlegrounds. You'll find it on Amazon for sure, without the subheading. And it's a great read. And we encourage everybody, once the semester's over, you're gonna need a little time. So, you know, but we have extra time this year at Duke in between semesters because of COVID. So I think they could get through Battlegrounds during the break after Thanksgiving. What do you think? Should we make that a sign?
I've heard it's a page turner, David.
Well, we're so grateful, and thank you again. And we're going to be adjourned then. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.
Good evening.